Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey. And this week, it's an episode that I'm really excited for. It is where we're going to be discussing the dangers of ayahuasca told me. And if you have gone to an ayahuasca ceremony, attended, participated in, you will automatically know what I'm talking about. And if not, you will learn. So very much looking forward to our chat with Jerónimo Mazarrasa. I'm going to have to start over again. I just did not say that well enough. Okay, I'm gonna.
It was pretty good.
I I'm very picky. I want to get I want to respect the names. So I want to get the names right. I have literally re-recorded names so many times. I'm just gonna give
Mm.
myself a little edit button here. With Jerónimo Mazarrasa. Jerónimo is program director at ICEERS, founder of ICEERS Academy, and creator of AyaSafety, an online course for people interested in increasing the safety of ayahuasca ceremonies. Now, before we get to our chat, just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one last reminder, if you are a clinician or you know a clinician who would like to learn more about psychedelic medicine and how it may be able to benefit their patients, please check out the Psychedelic Medicine Association. It is our mission to get clinicians of all types, doctors, nurses, therapists, counselors, etc., up to speed on psychedelics so that when patients come asking, you feel confident to have conversations with them. You can find us at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Now, without further ado, thanks so much for joining us today, Jerónimo.
Thank you, Limri. Happy to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this because 100% I'm just going to admit up front, I have said this to people. Ayahuasca told me, and man, the stuff she said, I thought was like gospel because man, if you hear it from ayahuasca, this is real, right? And then very much learned the lessons the hard way. And so when you reached out and suggested this topic, I thought, man, if we could save some other people from having the same misconceptions, this would really make my day. So, if we could start by if you could talk a little bit about um, some of, for those who have not undergone an ayahuasca ceremony, some of these kind of common phenomena that happen. One of them being that you feel like you get some kind of direct message.
Yes, I mean, the first thing I would say is that one of the main reasons why people drink ayahuasca is because of the things that ayahuasca tells you. So this is not a dangerous thing in itself, but it can be dangerous in certain circumstances. And a lot of it has to do with the interpretation that you make of what you've been told. Now, there's some debate about whether ayahuasca says anything or you're just thinking out loud while you drank ayahuasca. I mean, not even thinking that, you're just think. So to clarify, for people that have never drunk ayahuasca, you will drink ayahuasca, you usually sit in the dark and you're lost in your thoughts. And then certain thoughts seem to come with it almost feels like they're coming outside of you. It feels like you're being told, like, for example, you're being told that you should quit your job, or you're being told that this relationship is not good for you, or you're being told that this and that, or that this person was very important. And I mean, this you're not being told, tomorrow is going to rain or something. Like, it's usually something that is, significant, emotionally significant for you, whether it's about your past or about your future, or in another place altogether that seems to be, part of some, I don't know what to call, the spiritual realm also. But whatever shape it takes, it always or often takes this form of, it feels like it's something that you're being told, not something that you're thinking. But in fact, you're just hearing yourself think in your own head the same way, except, amplified by ayahuasca.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for clarifying that that is actually the phenomenon that's happening and how often we mistake it for being like told something from another world, basically, is what it can often feel like, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's an endless sort of debate about, what is it? Are you hearing the voice of your, inner, intuition? Is it the voice of your, amplified voice of your intuition? Is it the voice of the plant itself? Is it the voice of the spirit of the plant? There's endless debate about this. I don't think it's a very useful debate in terms of, like, even if you solve, which you're not going to be able to do, even if you solve that this is, the voice of your subconscious versus, the voice of the plant. Even if you were able to make this distinction, which you want, you still have a much more interesting problem, which is what are you going to do with what you heard? And I think this is the problem that I like to focus on. Instead of trying to just sort of determine, the source of the voice, because this problem is interesting enough in itself, and because for some people it can have really significant impact in their lives. Some people take quite radical decisions based on and make quite radical changes in their lives based on what ayahuasca tells them. Sometimes this goes very well, and sometimes it doesn't. So I think there's enough conversation out there about when it goes well, and perhaps not enough about when it doesn't. And that's sort of the topic I'm interested in.
Yes. Well, then let's dive into that. So, like I said, it's especially early on in my psychedelic days, had that experience. And I recall sharing it with somebody who had, he was Shipibo trained, and just the look on his face was so dismissive that I should have known immediately that this was not a thing that I should have put weight on. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe either through stories or what have you, some of the situations where taking it very literally can be a danger?
I mean, I can give many examples. I would say I don't facilitate ayahuasca ceremonies myself. I am not a psychologist, but through my work with the ICS Foundation and previous work, what I did working in documentaries, I've spent a lot of time and spoken to many facilitators, and also many mental health professionals, psychologists. And what I did was basically collect a pool of stories and knowledge that was very unevenly distributed through a very large field, which is the field of ayahuasca, and begin to collect all of these things and make a sort of repository, a resource of all of these stories that could be useful for people, especially for people facilitating, because people facilitating tend to sort of work in kind of bubbles where they don't, because the work sometimes is clandestine, because of many reasons. There's also a lot of distrust sometimes between facilitators. There's not a lot of sort of knowledge that sort of circulates the way knowledge circulates, for example, among surfers or among basketball players or golfers, or where you see that, very quickly people figure things out and then everybody learns. This is not the case in the ayahuasca world and in general with psychedelics. So part of the work that we did and the work that ICS Academy is just sort of, collecting all of this stuff that I'm bringing back and I'm presenting here, but it's not my own making, or it's not, or not even my own conclusions, but merely sort of a collection of wise words for people for much more experience than myself. So with that said, one example that I've seen of ayahuasca told me going wrong has to do with predictions. So people will, I will give you an example from an indigenous context. In the Amazon jungle, somebody's child. This is a true story. It was like an 8-year-old disappeared, and then didn't return for a few days, and the father was very worried. So he drank ayahuasca, like is commonly done, to try to see where his son was. He drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca told him that his son had been killed by his neighbor. So, and that's why he wouldn't appear. So the next morning he went and he killed his neighbor. I repeat, this is a true story, something that happened in the Amazon. The child reappeared like 2 days later. He had been lost in the jungle, and it had taken him this long. So sometimes ayahuasca makes predictions which are very, very accurate. And sometimes ayahuasca makes predictions that are completely inaccurate. So what is happening there with many of these things is that the way that ayahuasca becomes useful for people, I think, is that it shows you, it sort of amplifies and shows you what is already inside of yourself. Now, this is very useful for certain things, but one has to understand the nature of the language. So very often what happens is that ayahuasca will show you, for example, your desires or your fears. but you will not, it will not tell you this is your desire or this is your fear. It will just present this desire in front of you. For example, this job, or this of being an ayahuasca shaman, or being a rock star, or quitting your job, or moving to, these are your desires, but they're not presented as, hey, these are your desires, look at it. They're presented simply as an image of that desire, which you take to mean, you interpret as your future. So, for example, ayahuasca will tell you, well, this such and such person is destined to become your partner. Now, sometimes this is true, but sometimes what you're being shown is that you actually desire for this to happen. And this desire is what you're seeing, but you interpret it as your future. And you say, no, ayahuasca told me. I will show you, give you another example. This woman had a vision, and sometimes the visions are even less clear. So one time, this woman had a vision of babies. She saw babies during her ayahuasca ceremony, and she took it to mean that babies were in her future and that she was meant to have children with her partner. Now, it was only years after, when they divorced, that she realized that what ayahuasca was showing her is that both her and her partner were behaving like babies.
Very different.
It's in these sort of difficulties and in interpretation where things get tricky. It gets, I will mention 3 cases that are very, very common. Ayahuasca told me to quit my job, sometimes to quit my job and become a shaman. Ayahuasca told me to leave this relationship, leave my partner. I'm not sure that ayahuasca will ever tell you to quit your job. I think what ayahuasca definitely is telling you is that you hate your job.
Right.
That's one very true message. So, I had a facilitator I respect with a lot of experience, and he once told me, everything ayahuasca shows you is true. Everything is true, but they are internal truths. Sometimes these internal truths, they have an external validity as well. And sometimes they don't. And it's in this process of discernment, how you separate these inner truths from what actually is going on in the world, that one begins to learn how to establish a relationship to ayahuasca that is long-term and that is sustainable. That you have to begin to understand the language in which these messages come and how you should take them. Another very common message is, ayahuasca told me to separate from my partner. I think ayahuasca for sure is telling you you're unhappy with your partner. And for sure, ayahuasca is even telling you that you might have a desire to separate. And this desire might be not very conscious and not very strong until you drank ayahuasca, and then it becomes amplified. And suddenly it seems almost like a task. Now, the mistake that people make very often is they say, well, ayahuasca told me this, and this is some sort of gospel. So, I'm going to go, and immediately, as after I come back from the jungle, I'm going to start the divorce proceedings. And to make it even worse, I'm going to tell my partner that I'm doing this because ayahuasca told me that I should do this, which I think is of all of these errors, is the worst, is the worst one, right? Because in a way, you are putting the responsibility of the decision outside of yourself. So the question is, when should I leave my partner after ayahuasca tells me to leave my partner? I would say the most safe answer is when you can tell your partner, I have thought about it, and I have decided that we should break up, without bringing ayahuasca into the equation, because of course, your partner is going to say, like, what the hell, you went and you took some, and now, and in a way you are sort of relinquishing certain responsibility that is like, no, it's your relationship, it's your partner, and you should really think about it, consider all the pieces, how this is going to affect everybody, whether this is the best. And if you still make this decision, then go ahead. So, one thing that we recommend in the course that we teach in the safety course is what is called, first of all, that facilitators should instruct their participants that one rule is that you shouldn't make any decisions during an ayahuasca ceremony, unless there are decisions like unless there are decisions that are related to taking yourself out of danger. So if ayahuasca tells you to quit smoking, to quit heroin, to quit, by all means, do it the next day. Don't wait to see, but taking those important, with that important caveat, putting that aside. For most of the things, quitting your job, selling everything and moving to the Amazon, leaving your partner of 20 years, starting a new relationship with somebody else, a new venture, a new business. If it's true and it's important, it will be just as true today as 1 month from now. And just for precaution's sake, you should try to put a few weeks between the experience, which is very powerful and can be very confusing, and any sort of life-changing, decisions. So this is the first sort of the first tip, that we give facilitators when dealing with this, because very often what happens is people drink ayahuasca, they get this message, and then they go to the facilitator and they say, ayahuasca told me to leave my wife. What should I do? And to that, the right answer is, wait. And if you're still thinking this 1 month from now, okay. There's other sort of tips or practices that I learned from other very experienced facilitators that I found useful. One is the rule of the three confirmations, and that says that if you're going to do something life-changing based on what ayahuasca told you, then you should wait to have three confirmations. The first confirmation should come from ayahuasca itself, because sometimes you drink ayahuasca and you hear one thing and then it never comes again. And that's not as important or as valuable as something that you hear and then it returns a few ceremonies later, and then it returns a few ceremonies later. Okay, that carries a different weight and it should be regarded differently. The second confirmation is from people who know you and you respect, and know you for a long time, and they can say, well, you know what, knowing you as I know you for all of this time, I think this decision that you're about to make, makes sense. That's also an important confirmation to have. And the third confirmation is from a person whose knowledge or wisdom you respect, and that is, sort of that can give you better advice. Now, all of these helps you sort of discern and make, very big decisions, which sometimes are completely the right thing to do and sometimes are not. And in any case, even if they are the right thing to do, just out of precaution, if you're going to turn your life around with a lot of moving pieces, just you can do it slowly with precaution and like you would do any other life change, with proper planning and with time and thinking of the consequences. Again, this doesn't apply to situations in which you are in danger or you're putting yourself in danger, such as, an addiction, an abusive relationship, etc., etc.
I think it's a great point that you brought up the facilitators discussion with them and having them hold off. And I love the advice to wait until it's no longer because ayahuasca told you, but it's because it's something for many reasons. But one is actually to protect the facilitator, because so many stories I've heard is that,
Yeah.
at least I'm in the US, Jerónimo was in Spain, but here, like, lawsuit wise, it's generally what I hear is it's an angry family member who was likely divorced based on an instruction from ayahuasca. And since they can't sue ayahuasca, they're going to sue the facilitator and come out to the facilitator. And it's a great way to cause a lot of problems when you're,
Yeah.
like you said, putting it on that external force instead of just taking the onus on yourself. Like, no, this was my decision that I made. And so thank you for elucidating how that's important for a number of reasons. And I wondered in the story about the misinterpretation of the babies, how in retrospect, like if somebody were to get that message, and I know this is probably a very difficult answer to give, but how would one know the proper way to interpret something like that? Is that something that hopefully you're working with a skilled integration person and they're able to help you work with that? Like, that's, to me, I'm like, if I saw that, I mean, I never wanted babies, so I wouldn't personally be confused. But if I had gotten a similar message, I don't, how do you know how to interpret it so that you can hopefully not misinterpret it?
Yeah, I mean, what I have seen, again, the very experienced facilitators that I have known is they go very deep into the details. It's like, okay, you saw babies, how, in which context, where were the babies standing, what was around the babies, what were you thinking before that, and what you thought after that, and that gives you all sorts of pieces. Like I saw, for example, this facilitator working with a patient who had had what looked like a very beautiful vision in which he turned into an eagle and it spread its wings and like all of this, and then as the facilitator began to ask questions, after some 5 minutes, facilitator is like, but actually, this eagle is just like standing on the ground, it's not flying, it's only opening its wings. And what do you think? What do you think that means? Does that feel, and suddenly the person begins to see, just how this relates. So usually, if you ask enough questions about it, and this is, a good integrator and a good psychologist can do it, you begin to see how this vision is still deeply meaningful to the person. But that doesn't mean that the person will interpret it, that the person will go directly at the message, precisely because it's so precisely because, again, some of it, I mean, this, another facilitator told me that ayahuasca is basically like a microscope, and it makes small things look very big. Now, when you look at a flea on the microscope, it looks like a horrible monster, but it's actually just a flea. So there's all of these aspects that are sort of roaming in our subconscious, in our the things that we don't think about, we don't like to think about, small feelings that we suppress, small bothers, small hopes, small dreams. These things also get amplified with ayahuasca to take this sort of like. And because we are unaware of these things very often, the first interpretation that we'll give on them is not actually tapping on it, but it takes some work. It takes the person needs some company. It needs some integration to be able to sort of unpack these.
And could you elucidate a little bit about the decision-making time period? I like that instead of giving a strict time, you said wait until that decision is yours and not ayahuasca's. But is there a general, after ayahuasca, period of time where it's advisable not to make major life decisions of any sort because the effects of the medicine may still be with you and affecting your thought process in a way?
Yes, I mean, ayahuasca opens people up and it makes them very suggestible. And this is not a bug. This is a feature. This is the reason why people drink ayahuasca. And, but in certain contexts, it can turn dangerous because you're very open and because you're very suggestible, right? So it's sort of like I always say, it's like, the whole point of cars is that they can go very fast. We could make cars that went, 40 miles an hour and it would be much safer and nobody would have these terrible accidents, but we wouldn't be interested in that, right? The point of having a car is that it can take you, 60 or 70 miles an hour to some other place. So we're not willing to give up the speed for safety. A similar trade-off comes with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca opens people up and it makes small things in themselves very big and very big things gigantic, and this is not a bug. This is a feature. This is the reason why people drink ayahuasca. However, with this opening and this comes certain dangers. And this is where, especially in ayahuasca, because they're, almost always guided ceremonies. So there's always the role of the facilitator. This is where there are all sorts of dynamics that one have to be extremely careful about. This is what I would call the hygiene of guided psychedelic facilitation. In a surgery room, the hygiene has to do with, asepsis, keeping the place extremely clean, so there's no bacteria, there's nothing, because you're about to cut somebody open and you don't want anything to go inside the person other than, and that's hygiene. In ayahuasca, you have a similar situation, but it has to do with the psyche of the person, with the psychology of the person. So how does the facilitator maintain hygiene in their relationship with somebody who's completely open, usually incredibly thankful, and also very, very suggestible? This is something that I never tire of watching very experienced facilitators do, because it's fascinating to me. And I've seen, and I work with a lot of sort of traditionally trained facilitators, and there's a certain care and distance that the good ones keep in their most intimate interventions, because there's sort of, you've seen it with tobacco, there's the sopladas, and there's the perfumes, and there's all of this sort of healing aspect of the ritual that it's very intimate and it's very beautiful, and people are wide open, and if you are receiving it, it can be one of the most wonderful things that you've ever received, and you are so grateful to this person, and you are putting everything on the person. And I've seen some facilitators just do this incredible sopladas, and then immediately after they're done, they just turn around and leave as fast as they can. And that's so you will not latch on to them.
Yeah.
And that's the hygiene. That's how you maintain hygiene. If you do the amazing soplada and you say, are you feeling good? Are you doing okay? And then I tap you in the shoulder, and then maybe I give you a little hug, which is, it's okay, but then the person, will associate this incredible experience that they live themselves inside of them, with this other person, but actually this other person, and it's a very, interesting. Now, after 20 years, I've done just a little bit, just in a couple of ceremonies, I've been in the sort of supporting role of a facilitator. And it's the first time in my life that I've been on the other side, and I've watched it from the facilitator side. And it's just amazing how people are not. Then there you see it. There you see that, just a song and it's not much, just creates this wave on the person, and then you absolutely have to very quickly remove yourself. And this is just an example, but then what happens when they tell you their and their experience, and then they begin to tell you their problems, and they begin to, how do you maintain the sort of closeness and intimacy without overstepping boundaries of, how do you suggest, and that's the sort of art of facilitating. It's not something we do a lot of work in the course to try to sort of like structure certain best practices and certain wrong places. But at the end, it's it's more an art than a technique or than a science, because it's so deeply personal. And again, this is not a bug, right? This is a feature. This is part of what makes, ayahuasca ceremonies so special. It's not something problematic in and of itself, except when it becomes problematic, except when people overstep those boundaries. They give advice where they shouldn't. They engage in romantic relationships with their participants. They engage in business relationships with their participants. They engage, this is where things get muddy.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's really important for people to know, coming in from the participant side as well. I recall before my first one, I had read very little, but I had read it is common for you to develop feelings for the facilitator. Like, it was one of the things that I saw. And in the ceremony, I definitely recall seeing the facilitator and like having that thought, and instantly like my brain pulled out this is normal, and just like threw out, right? And I was like, well, how useful that I saw that ahead of time, right? And so part of what we love to do in this podcast is educate people who may be about to undergo psychedelics, or maybe you're integrating from one if you have done something, and to go in armed knowing that these things are possible is hopefully like a layer of protection against misinterpreting things.
This is going to happen, exactly. You're going to find the facilitator absolutely amazing, all wise, insanely powerful. And then again, it's how that is managed. I had one ayahuasca ceremony with a facilitator I respect a lot, and it was just one of those amazing nights, and he sang so well, and the music was just gorgeous, and I cried and I praised the Lord, everything, and when the night was over and they turned on the lights, I went immediately to him to give him a hug and to say, oh, thank you, that was so wonderful. And he just looked at me and he said, disfrútalo, which in Spanish means you enjoy it. You enjoy it. And this is what I mean about the hygiene. It's not this feeling that I was feeling, which was absolutely wonderful and true, was not for me to project on this person. This feeling was for me to enjoy. Go back to your seat and be like, oh, I'm so happy, and just be with it. Just be with your happiness instead of trying to put it on somebody else. Take it and then create all sorts of, because you think it's this person, because now this person begins to think that maybe they're special, and all of these feeds these sort of dangerous dynamics.
That's such wise advice. We did an episode that came out a few weeks ago on cult dynamics and guruism in psychedelic circles. And we talked about exactly what you said, is that you are so grateful that the facilitator helped you come to this state of joy. And yes, they did. But when you then make them responsible for
Yeah.
that joy, right? And then I love what you just said, is not only is that detrimental maybe to you, but to them in their own then potentially inflated ego and development of guruism in the worst case scenarios. So thank you for pointing out that on both
Yeah.
sides that there's an issue with that.
Yeah, what's interesting about Guruism is that you need two. You don't just need somebody who wants to be a guru, but you need somebody who wants a guru. And you have even examples of gurus who never wanted to be gurus, but the disciples made them gurus anyway. There's a very interesting case of Jerry Garcia of the great or the Grateful Dead, who was playing the most amazing music for all of these people that were many of them very high on psychedelics, and they begin to develop all sorts of because the music was so wonderful. And Jerry Garcia never wanted this, so he became more and more closed in himself. He stopped talking during concerts because every word he said became amplified and taken as some sort of gospel. The lyrics of his songs became more and more, and eventually he became quite depressed at this adoration that he was receiving. So, we often put a lot of the sort of responsibility and the blame on the guru, and for sure it is there. But I just want to remark that, that it's a dynamic that happens between two, right? You need the disciple to have the guru, and sometimes you can have some people want to be disciples so badly, or they will fall naturally into this place that even when you have a person who absolutely doesn't want to be a guru, the phenomenon happens anyway.
Yeah, thank you for putting a point on that. And it's funny, when we did the guruism and cult dynamics episode, the guest said, I have a bunch of Jerry Garcia stories, and then we didn't get to them. And so thank you for throwing that in, because it's finally come up. But again, with the hygiene, right, is that Jerry Garcia had the mental wherewithal to realize what was happening and then try to withdraw in a way that would get people to be less likely to see him in that guru way.
I mean, at least withdraw any sort of direction, right? He spoke through his music, and then people were free to interpret the music in their way, but there was no messages. He was not putting out any messages on the microphone that people could, or in his interviews.
Yeah.
Even that, it's funny. The other story like this, the other famous guru who didn't never wanted to be a guru was Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti, people couldn't record his talks. He would just talk, and they were forbidden from this. And people were recording in any way, transcribing them in secret, taking notes in secret. And he worked very hard not to become a guru, and he became a guru anyway.
Very interesting. And back to ayahuasca, there's times when, like, I think what's interesting that I would like to pull apart is you said most of the things that quote unquote ayahuasca tells you are things that are inside your psyche somewhere. And there's an episode that we're going to release soon is about false insights on ayahuasca. And so do you have any thoughts on when, for example, if ayahuasca tells me there's no repressed memories or something, which is something that it has come up in one of mine, is how do you evaluate maybe the truth of something that it tells you that's not like a prediction, but something within yourself, like if it tells you, oh, I've suffered this thing or I haven't suffered this thing, is that another instance where just working with the facilitator? Or I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, that's an incredible. I mean, you mentioned two things. One that is a fairly recurrent thing is ayahuasca told me I'm already healed. This is sort of like this is something that should be taken with precaution, because usually, you know, things, illnesses, conditions, pathologies, they take a long time to develop. And because of this same thing, they usually take a long time to heal. It's rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, but it's one of those revelations that should be taken with a grain of salt and with some careful consideration, because usually, especially like deep settled problems, addictions, etc., they will not go away from one day to the next, because it took a long time to get where the person is, and it's probably going to take some work. No, ayahuasca is not a shortcut for personal development. It's just a flashlight that can help you shed some light on some darker parts of the issues and the problems. But it's not a shortcut. It's not a. And then the other, and this is sort of an extremely delicate one, is when people revive memories or recover memories of usually of abuse that can be physical or sexual. And then people have this comes back during the ayahuasca, and then they go to the facilitator and say, ayahuasca told me that such and such, I've suffered such and such abuse that I didn't know until tonight. Is it true? Right? And and there's only one right answer to that question. And the right answer is, I don't know, but I know somebody who's an expert on this stuff that you could talk to help you. This, I don't know. Sometimes these things happen. I know somebody you should talk to. Why is I don't know the right answer? Because if a person recovers a memory of a traumatic abuse, and it's a false memory, and you tell the person that is true, you're going to harm the person and possibly other people involved. And if a person recovers a memory of a traumatic event and it's not true, and you tell the person, so the chances for harm in the interpretation that the facilitator will make are so big that it's just not worth taking that step, even if you're sure of it. It is extremely difficult, even for trained professionals with psychology, psychiatry degrees who study this stuff, to actually help people discern these memories. Now it's not exactly the same thing. Someone who knows that they've been abused and then they drink ayahuasca and they recover an additional piece of information. That is not exactly the same as someone who had no knowledge at all and suddenly they know. So that's also sort of a caveat to separation. But generally speaking, these processes are so incredibly delicate and complex. It's so hard to establish the facts and to get to certainty in some answers, that it really is not the place the night after an ayahuasca ceremony by a person who doesn't have the proper training, who hasn't had long conversations, to make this sort of like, to go on a feeling on something that has such like, potentially catastrophic effects over not just one person's life, but usually many. So that's one of the sort of like hardest things. There's also, and I cannot, I can sort of report on this. I cannot validate it. There's often reports that these things also seem to happen in certain ceremonies to certain groups. So there's something that seems to sometimes, or so I heard, it's also in the air. So there's one person that was actually abused, but other people pick up on it or get. This is some, again, I cannot verify it, but this is something just sort of to give an idea of how sort of complex these interpretations can get and how delicate they are, how careful one has to be with them. I also go back to this story that this facilitator told me, that everything ayahuasca tells you, it's true. but they're only internal truths. So if you feel that there was an abuse with a certain person, that feeling is true. Now, whether that happened in physical, real life with that person, that's something that is going to take much deeper work for you to discern. That does see, like there's also you don't have to actually outright dismiss it necessarily, but just sort of like separate a little bit from it and say, okay, this was this feeling, there's truth to this feeling, but what it means and in real physical existence is going to take work and discernment, and sometimes it never gets sorted, and a lot of the work that the people who do know how to work with this do is basically getting people to accept that they just had this memory and that they might never know whether it's true or not, and they just have to, and this is something that they have to live with and adapt to. This is also important. The people that do work with this stuff and that they know what they're doing, they still can't very often tell you, or validate these things for you. So it's one more reason why caution, and a certain distance. And of course, it's difficult when something a revelation like this comes to someone, but all the more reason to be very careful and move very slowly.
I love what your facilitator that you're speaking of said, and what you added there, because I think that's what came up in our discussion that we had on the other episode is this: what do you do with what you have now, and can you live with the uncertainty, and what difference does it make to know 100% certain or not whether it happened? What does matter is how you feel about what how you're feeling about that. And like you said, the feeling came from somewhere and the feeling is true. And so the exact way that it may have been interpreted in your journey may not be exactly what happened. And so you've got to kind of leave space for that and then come back to the real world and say, well, how do I deal with the actual feelings that I have, whether or not the thing I saw? So thank you for re-putting a point on that. I think that's extremely important. Before we wrap up, you said you have a number of stories, and we've covered a number of areas where there's like the quit your job or the leave a spouse or abuse did or didn't happen. Are there any other major realms of ayahuasca told me that you've gathered in your discussions with facilitators?
Yeah, I mean, it also came, there's a very interesting quote from Carl Jung. And he said that when people engage in sort of, psychotherapeutic and exploration of their subconscious, and material from the subconscious, it begins to sort of rise to the conscious mind. It takes the shape of tasks and duties. So when material from the subconscious emerges, it doesn't emerge as material from the subconscious. It emerges as a mission, as a duty, as something that you are compelled to do or that you must do. I think this is very useful, and it ties very well with something, another facilitator told me. This is a traditionally trained Amazonian facilitator. And he said that no message that comes from the spiritual world will ever take the shape of an order. It takes the shape of a choice. So if you want to discern when you have you are given some sort of command or mission, and you want to help you discern whether it comes from your ego or whether it comes from another place, then the question is, was it presented as a choice or was it presented as a task? You have to do this versus you could do this or you could do that. What do you want to do? And what they were saying, and I want to be able to speak to everyone, to people who are spiritual and not. So you don't have to be spiritual to understand this. What they were saying is that things that are presented as choice should have more weight. That things that are presented as duty or task or mission, they are more because they are things, but you see why, because they're things that respect, your freedom, your autonomy, and your possibilities. And indeed, we always have a choice. And one should be just a little bit, not fully, but just a little bit cautious with any material that emerges in the shape of some sort of like, well, that there's no choice, that this is what you have to do.
Yeah, I think
This,
that's
yeah,
brilliant.
yeah,
Uh, I always recall a friend of mine went to a ceremony and he was telling me about some of the people in the ceremony that went down there married, and they go to the ceremony and they are told in the ceremony they're supposed to be with each other and leave their spouses. And I said, you take the ayahuasca out of that story and that's just two people having an affair. I said that like it seems
yeah.
so like spiritually ordained. I said, but without that, what would this story look like if you're like, oh, they went to a business conference, met each other, left their spouses. I said, great, way to take all the responsibility. We're not cheaters. We were just told, we had to do this thing.
Yeah. And that's when it goes back to the story you said about the angry relative. In the course we have 5 dangers for facilitators and 4 dangers for the participants, and that's one of the dangers for both of them, and it's very, very common, which is like, one person will take a big decision in their life based on what ayahuasca tell them, sometimes starting a new relationship with somebody else in the circle, and then the person left out, and usually this gets very ugly, sometimes in divorces and when there's children and custody in the middle. And then it's this sort of angry relative or angry relation that just like takes it, blames, actually does similar thing to the other person. They both of them are putting the blame on ayahuasca, right? Like that, one person is saying, well, I'm just doing what ayahuasca told you, and the other person is saying ayahuasca is guilty, of all of this, and they're both putting the blame there.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other dangers to watch out for that we should leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
I
Any
think
other words of wisdom?
I think one thing that is very that just sort of helps to see how difficult this is the tension between sort of externalization on one side and psychologization on the other, and they're both dangerous. So externalization is when you attribute all your problems to spirits or to parasites or to envy or to witchcraft or to past lives or to trauma or to external evil, or without taking any responsibility from them. Like it's like, my problem, I saw my problem, and my problem is outside of myself. That's externalization. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it isn't, right? So we have a story of a person who avoided all job interviews and was convinced that he couldn't get a job because he'd been jinxed. There's been a sort of like a curse put on him, right? So those cases, you need integration to recover agency. And then you have the other external, which is psychologization, where you believe that everything is about you, and it's all like, it's all your, all contents that are emerging are psychological dynamics, and you're just sort of flattening everything and not catching actually other messages that come from another place. So it's neat. And this is just sort of, I think it's a good story to close, because it shows that there's really no one size fits all, easy cut solutions. So very often in the course we get these questions, and the answer is always, well, it depends, because it really depends. So it's not that ayahuasca is always true. It's not that ayahuasca is always false. It's not that it's all in the psyche, and it's not that it's all outside of yourself. And it's not, and it depends. It depends. It depends. That's why the sort of the additional work and the container is so important around these things. Now, I have been drinking ayahuasca for 20 years. I more than 20 years. I have my work revolves all around this. I'm deeply committed to the promise and the healing that these plants can bring, and that I've seen them in myself. And at the same time, it is one of the most sort of confusing, delicate challenging processes, and I really mean process like, I've been drinking 20 years and it still surprises me. I've spoken to hundreds of facilitators and I still need to go and check with 3 or 4 of them to even begin to understand some of the things that happened to me. It hasn't gotten any easier after all of these years. uh, it has had, a profound effect in my life, for the better, and I still wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's a decision that people have to make by themselves, and this is the most, I think this is the most important part. I think um, the main contraindication of psychedelics is not wanting to take psychedelics. You should absolutely never, ever, 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 ever take psychedelics if you don't want to, because it's going to be horrible. It's like it's like a kiss. When you want it, it's beautiful, intimate, gorgeous. When you don't want it, it's the most intrusive, disgusting, blech thing ever. So don't do it. Don't do it if you don't want to. Yeah.
That's such a great place to end. But because you are in Spain and because somebody's going to write into Instagram and ask, the thing that ayahuasca told me was that I am supposed to live on the coast of Spain. So at some point, I sell everything, almost everything, and take off for Europe. Luckily, my dad stepped in. He's like, maybe you want to like keep a few things, right? I lasted 4 weeks. And then I came back and I was like, I think I must have misunderstood the message. I mean, maybe the message was check out Spain, realize that that's not somewhere you want to live, because I think a lot of times those of us in the US, we romanticize running off and moving to Europe, right? And so I don't romanticize that anymore. I tried it. We're good. I like San Diego, but it's funny that you should be. Where in Spain are you?
I'm in Ibiza.
All right. Well, there's plenty of coast of Spain around here. But I think that once you got on and reminded me that you were from Spain, I'm like, the synchronicity. I love it too much. So thank you
I
for
mean,
having yes. Go ahead.
I think ayahuasca told you that you really wanted to move to the coast of Spain. You know,
What's funny is that when that happened, I remember thinking, I've never thought about the coast of Spain because I've spent time in Madrid and I loved Madrid, but I'd never thought about the coast of Spain. And so and I'm a surfer and I like up and go to Malaga and there's like no, I mean,
waves,
there's no way.
Mediterranean, no waves.
I mean, it should have either been more specific or definitely just said you need a vacation. One
The
of the two.
north, yeah.
Right? It was all kind of a comic lesson that I can look back and laugh now, and thank goodness there are some things I did not sell. But yeah, I've learned my lesson. No harm, no foul. Not like the Peruvian story you started off with, but that's why I laughed when you recommended this topic, because I was like, had I heard this episode, I would have liked to have heard this episode before I did, it was like my seventh and eighth ayahuasca ceremonies where that came up. And I'm hoping that somebody out there can take all of the important things that you've shared today and arm themselves before, if, like you said, if they feel actually called to do ayahuasca, and then they go in with that knowledge and hopefully can come out with better ways to interpret what they saw. So, Jerónimo, thank you so much for joining us. And can you tell people where to find out more about your work?
Yes, I mean, I'll share some links, but I work with ICEERS Foundation, ICEERS, ICEERS, and .org. And, we basically specialize in supporting our work is focused on the challenges of the globalization of plant medicine. So we basically focus on ayahuasca, iboga, and other plants that have a history of traditional use. And we try to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms that comes from the globalization of these plants. We would like to see a future in which these plants people who want to can access these practices in a legal and safe ways all over the world. And we also teach a course in ICEERS Academy, ICEERS.academy, which is called AyaSafety, and it's about increasing the safety of ayahuasca ceremonies and other plant medicines.
Thank you for that. Everybody check out their courses if you're interested. And thank you again for the idea and the topic and for everything you've come on and shared.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate that. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time.